First of all, I hope you're all well. This is a message for Tranmere fans who have rightly been asking what my position is, what the club's position is with regard to finishing the 1920 season. Firstly, whatever I say today is against the sad backdrop that over 40,000 people have died in this country. And with respect to the people who are trying to sort out football, I understand the complexities of trying to manage the logistics of starting a new season, the medical issues, the safety issues, the welfare issues that they're facing, the practical logistical difficulties, and the financial difficulties facing the game as a whole, and a lot of clubs in particular in Leagues 1 and 2 of the English Football League. What I want to do is to give Tranmere fans what my stance is as regards the question of how we finish the season. I want to talk in terms of what options the EFL and the clubs have in the context of the current rules and regulations, which clearly don't anticipate a pandemic. And what's necessary to change the rules in mid-season, which is effectively what we're talking about if we decide to not finish the season, because at the end of the day we still have the option to finish the season. And then finally I want to briefly talk about a solution which does need a lot more detail put on it, but I think tries to recognise what people want to achieve in terms of promotions, etc., but not at anyone's expense. It's a solution that's suggested that may well start to get rid of some of the legal actions that have been threatened, but importantly it actually addresses the issue and tries to address it in a sense of fairness for all. Firstly, the EFL recognises that this is uncharted territory. We don't have rules and regulations to address this particular issue. The second thing I want to really stress is that in a sporting competition, and in competitions generally, everyone will recognise that you set the rules at the start of the competition, and everybody's happy, they understand the rules, they understand the consequences of success and failure within the competition. You don't change the rules of the league mid-season. What's most important, I think, that people understand is we still have the opportunity to finish the 1920 season. We can do that whenever we allowed, and the government allows us, and medical conditions and safety allows us to actually start playing again. And there's no reason why that shouldn't be the 1920 season. So we have the opportunity and the option to finish the 1920 season. I understand and I accept, and I've already said, that I think that the longer time goes on, the sporting integrity of that competition comes into question. Teams will play with teams of youth players if they've got nothing to play for, etc., once players are out of contract. And this is because the big issue facing the game is really the financial chasm that we're going to be walking into in the next few months. And so clubs quite rightly are looking at the ability to keep body and soul together, and that has become now the prime driver of whether or not clubs want to finish the season or not. So whilst it's within our gift, it's becoming increasingly difficult for clubs facing these financial difficulties to see the finish of the season, the finish of playing out the season. And that's important because doing this in the middle of the season, and for financial reasons I'll come back to later. So in the absence of the rules, as I see it, how should the season finish or be played out? If the decision is made that we will not play the season out, then I think it's quite clear that the season should be voided, rather than deciding on what is a mid-season change of rules on a fairly arbitrary decision as regards how we deal with promotion and relegation. Just to give you an example as to why maintaining the rules throughout the duration of the season is important, you can only have to look at the circumstances in which Tranmere Rovers finds itself. The club has in the past, as we all know, successfully operated in the January transfer window. The rules are set out, you can do that in January. We, in terms of maintaining a prudent budget, don't spend it all at the start of the season. We use the budget across the season, which is something that people in football now want you to do in terms of, exercise financial prudence. So we spend the money in January, and we have over the past 4 seasons, and it was starting to happen again this season, seen the benefit of that as we've rebuilt parts of the squad and then seen our points per game increase dramatically in the second half of the season. We've all experienced, you all know, we've had three runs that have taken us to 3 Wembley finals, and it was starting to happen again. We were the form team in League One, And so it's wrong for us to change the rules and not be able to have the benefit of what we expected to have as a consequence of the rules that were set out at the start of the competition. That's a simple example as to how, it is important to maintain the integrity of the competition by maintaining the rules that you had at the start right the way through. I understand that any change in the regulations requires a vote from the clubs, and equally any change in the regulations requires ratification by the FA. Interestingly, the FA have already opined on any decision to finish the season and how that will be dealt with in terms of promotions and relegations. In March of this year, when COVID was firstly starting to impact on the leagues, the FA's head of the National League system concluded that this was a position in relation to steps 3 to 7 of the National League, that the fairest method on how to decide the sporting outcomes for the season with the integrity of the leagues in mind, should they actually stop, was not to adopt PPG but to void the season. This was a situation whereby it was on all fours with that which we were experiencing in League One. The imperative was to actually look after the clubs who had a financial problem and were in financial difficulties and needed an early decision. I think the key precedent set here was the fact that they decided that points per game was not an appropriate way to end the season. Clearly, of course, in the EFL at this point in time, where clubs want to end the season for financial reasons, they equally want to recognise the rights to promotion. And I think you need to look at the decision by the FA as regards to why they came to that conclusion, which suggests that what you should do is either void the season or not. And I come back to my central premise that if you really want to recognise success by terms of promotion, it's not at the expense of relegating clubs. I think what is clear from certainly the last few weeks is that in order to find an acceptable compromise, it has to be just that. It has to be a compromise that is fair. And so I'll go on to suggest what I think is a solution which is in fact the one which has the least damage to any particular party and has an upside which means that we can move on quickly with regard to the decision regarding the 1920 season, which is important because we have so much uncertainty surrounding the whole environment of football and the whole world at this point in time. To get some certainty would enable clubs to better plan individually and also for the industry to get on and deal with the major issue that's coming for them, and that is the financial hole that will be appearing in the later summer months. So with regard to the suggested solution, it really follows on from what League Two voted in favour of last week. And whilst that's not a binding vote, it's indicative of where their intentions were. And that is, again, promotions without relegation. And of course I'd say that because I'm the chairman of Tranmere Rovers. But the reality is that if you take that to its logical conclusion, and if you expand the playoffs by looking at points per game and recognising that points per game is flawed as a mechanism, but possibly also recognising that that flaw can be measured in terms of the margin for error in terms of using PPG, then you potentially could get into a situation whereby what you could do is increase the numbers of teams who, in the league that doesn't wish to play the season out, those teams could get into the playoffs and therefore satisfy to some extent their ambitions as regards getting promotion and being given the sporting chance to play. So that's the suggestion that I think needs to be examined in more detail, and that's the suggestion that I think actually balances the needs of people such as the clubs who cannot afford to play out the season but wish to see success recognised, not at the expense of clubs being relegated, and make the regulation change mid-season, as I say, which is a difficult thing to do. I've called the compromise an inflationary compromise, because what it effectively does is increase the number of teams in the EFL for a number of years, and you can decide for yourselves how long, or the EFL can decide for itself how long it wants that size of EFL, if indeed it wants to reduce it. What it does do is, of course, include more inventory, more games, and it gives you more leverage to satisfy things such as the media rights ongoing going forwards. You've got revenues from the games themselves, but also what happens is it opens up the linkages with the National League and opens up a debate with the National League. So in conclusion, we're in uncharted territory. There aren't rules and regulations that can cover this point. What we have as options are either finish the season or to void it. But if we want to do something different mid-season, then we have to find an acceptable compromise, and one ultimately at the end of the day that is a fair compromise and is recognised as such by all. I hope that this has helped you understand the difficulties and the complexities surrounding this particular issue. And I often say to people, never mistake politeness for weakness, or in this case silence for inactivity, because there is a lot going on behind the scenes to try and ensure that we don't give up that hard-won League One status. So that just leaves me to say thank you for your support. Nicky and I never take it for granted, but we do appreciate it, and we appreciate the fact that in these difficult times, despite the lack of connectivity with the club, you've tried to maintain that. You've supported the club in terms of its community efforts with donations and volunteering, etc. So that is appreciated, and that's one of the big things about this club that I think people recognise and will stand us in good stead in the future going forward. It just leaves me now to say, please stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you as soon as we can.